I hope it's better now. Padmaj, please let me know if the echo is gone now.
The echo is gone, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. So I'll start sharing my screen now. And you can see it. There we go. So I'll start by thanking Padmaj, a dear friend, whom I took my fellowship with at the same time when he was doing his DM in Tata Memorial, and we had some great times together. And this is a topic which is very close to my heart, which I have talked about very often, only in informal settings. And I thought when Padmaj asked that, is there something which you'd like to take? I thought I can go ahead and take this topic, which I wanted to take as something which is a concept sort of clearing topic. It's many of these things you will know, but I wanted to put it together so that you get a clear idea of how to approach and what we are dealing with exactly. I have no disclosures, there are no conflicts of interest with any materials going to, and the guide in the suppress here the self-content. I often think of this quote when you think about what to do from Alice and in Wonderland.
Hello, Gaurav. Sorry to interrupt. Your voice is not clear. You probably need to be a bit slow and a bit loud. And
okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I put the microphone right next to my mouth now. I hope that's clear. Please let me know at any time when it's not coming out.
Yeah, that's better,
enough.
I suppose, yes.
Right. So Alice asked the Cheshire cat where she should go, and the cat said, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. And Alice said, I don't care where.
Yeah, we can't see your screen. Have you started sharing the screen?
Yes, I have.
No, we can't.
Okay, let me come out of that.
Just
Has it got disconnected here? Yeah. A lot of tech issues. Sorry. I've been on several Zoom meetings by now, and this is the first time I'm here seeing any problems.
Okay, it happens. Do you want me to share the screen?
I'll just open the link again. I'll just open the link again and just take it from there.
Do you want me to share the link? Or share the presentation?
You can, if you can do it from there, but because here the application is not launching right now.
Okay, let me see. I can probably.
I seem to be fully on audio for some reason. It's
just hold on a sec.
Yeah, okay, I've got it now.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Right. And
yes, you're coming. Yeah. You need to do slideshow. Slideshow.
There we go. Are we good now?
Yeah, that's good. Let's go ahead. We're all good now.
Right. Okay. So sorry for the delays. My apologies to keep you all waiting. So I just wanted to start with this quote from Alice and the Cheshire Cat, where if you don't know where you want to go, then it doesn't matter which. If you don't know where you're going, then it doesn't matter which way you go. So the reason why I'm fascinated by this topic is because right since my MBBS days, at least in the 80s, the eyes of etiology for anybody asks you the causes of anything, it would be either I don't know, or it was idiopathic if you wanted to sound a little smart. And if you wanted to sound really smart, and say the same thing, but still get the marks, you could say, sir, it has an immunological basis, and get away with murder. Made you sound intelligent. But the fact was that nobody really understood immunology very well, and it was a waste paper bin sort of diagnosis. You could dump anything in it. So first, I'll take you through a primer on the immune system so that we are all on the same page. The power of lymphocytes has always been fascinating to everyone who studies it, and definitely very fascinating to me. This is an image from Reuters, courtesy NIH, showing two lymphocytes attacking a cancer cell. Why is it important? Well, especially in the field in which I am, like pediatric hematolymphoid malignancies, the malignancies are themselves highly curable, and they are usually curable because of intensive chemotherapy, which results very often in severe immunosuppression. This is some consolidated data from our group, which shows you how curable these malignancies are. Even AML, we have up to 55% long-term survival, and ALL and CML, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphomas are highly curable. We have had era-wise improvement in disease like AML, and this shows you from the left to side how it has been improving. The green shows the newer eras, and it is all mostly due to supportive care. Same has been there in ALL. We've been able to bring our outcomes up to 70%. But as toxic deaths reduced, improved OS will come from treatment or relapses.
Hello,
The problem
Gaurav.
is yeah.
Hello. Yeah, need to be a bit loud. Yeah, voice should be a bit clearer.
Is that clearer now?
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Yeah, that's
nearly
better.
Eating my mic now.
No.
Sorry.
No, you can be slightly out of your mouth. This is better, much better. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the thing with ALL is that as toxic deaths reduce, OS will improve, but our toxic deaths reducing, that is our major burden now. So this is what shows you what I call the non-relapse gap. If you can see, the EFS and OS are improving, but what we see is at the end of induction, we have 74% EFS, but the cumulative risk of relapse is, however, nearly 21%. So the missing 9%, half of it is due to relapse, but nearly 4.6% deaths are occurring in remission due to toxicity. So this is where we lose a lot of our patients, and this is where we really need to do something about it. So what causes this mortality? Definitely, it's not just gram-negative bacterial infections, which is, of course, a major cause of mortality in all our patients who undergo cancer chemotherapy. But these are some examples to show that there can be many other causes too. Take the second paper, for example, from our group, which showed unforeseen toxicities in children with Burkitt lymphoma who were treated with rituximab. We found a whole lot of unusual toxicities, mostly related to viral infections and others. Also, we had a large outbreak of acute encephalitis, which was mostly due to herpes simplex HSV1 a few years ago, and it took a lot to overcome that. And all these occurred, unfortunate deaths occurred in children who were already in remission and should have survived. Even diseases like parvovirus can be huge in this setting and can often delay transplant, like we had in some of our cases. So these are all very common infections, and they are rampant. We have to look for them all the time. So getting back to the immune system, I think everybody knows, but I will just take you through the little primer over here, that it consists of two parts, the innate and adaptive immunity. The innate immunity is the first line of defense. It is selective but non-antigen specific, and it's a gatekeeper for adaptive immunity. Whereas the adaptive immunity is antigen-specific memory and consists mostly of B and T lymphocytes. Yeah, so the B lymphocytes basically act invaders from outside, and the T lymphocytes act invaders when they are inside the cells. The difference between innate and adaptive immunity is that it consists mostly of the phagocytes, and these also the gamma delta T cells and natural killer T cells are also part of the innate immunity, but they also are the transition points to the adaptive immunity. The B cells produce your antibodies, and the T cells, which are the CD4 and the CD8 cells, they are the ones which then go and attack the intracellular organisms. So the phagocytes first recognize the pathogen through pathogen-associated molecular patterns. This is non-specific, but they just recognize a pattern and engulf it, then they mature and they present it to the T cell, which takes it from there. And innate immunity can attack within hours. It also includes, very importantly, of the epithelial barriers and transition onto the adaptive immunity, which then takes days to maybe even a week or longer to do its action. So these are the short differences between the two. Just a quick recap. Innate immunity is specific for molecules shared by groups of related microbes, while the adaptive is for very specific microbes and even non-microbial antigens. Innate immunity has got a lot of diversity, is limited because it's germline encoded, but adaptive, it can keep adapting to repeated exposures. So the diversity of which it can recognize is huge. Innate immunity does not have any memory, adaptive does. And it's non-reactive to cell innate immunity, where it contains cellular and chemical barriers. So it includes the mucosal epithelia also, and also has it's shared with complements from blood proteins, and mostly consists of all the phagocytes, not just the neutrophils. Macrophages, natural killer cells, and innate lymphoid cells are also part of the innate immunity. Whereas adaptive immunity does have memory. It is also consists of mostly cellular components only, and it can produce antibodies, and the only cell involved in it is lymphocytes. So having got everybody through that quick recap of the immune system, I would like to quote to you this, what my teacher, Dr. Zinat Karamboy, told me when I was doing my fellowship with her in 2001. She is a great lady, and I could talk a lot about her. But one of her most memorable quotes is that the best way to find out the function of something is to see what happens when it goes missing. And she said primary and acquired immune deficiencies provide the perfect such opportunity to study what each component does. Now, we have studied a lot of this in physiology, and this is Dr. Zinat Karamboy. But the way it could all be put together into such simple terms and applied in the field of medicine, one had to learn from her. I call it the ZC dictum. Zinat Karamboy, the ZC dictum. So we'll come back to this dictum later on down the line. ZC, as we called her, was one of a kind. These are an example of her notes, painstakingly written notes about anything. This is how she would write down something to explain to someone like me. And I think they just don't make people like that anymore. So she told me about this unholy troika, that there are three things which always go hand in hand. Whenever you see one, the other two can't be far behind. This is malignancies. Whenever there's malignancies, you will find that there's immune deficiencies also. It'll either be related, malignancy causes immune deficiency, or immune deficiency can cause malignancy, and autoimmunity. These three go hand in hand, and they are areas where they intersect. So malignant disorders intersect with autoimmune disorders, or disorders of altered immunity and immune deficiency, and vice versa. So this is just to show that malignancies can cause immune dysregulation due to chemotherapy, surgery, or radiation, and lead to immune deficiency. Immune deficiency is known to cause autoimmune conditions like CVID, ALPS, and primary immune deficiencies. CVID is common variable immune deficiency. Autoimmune conditions like Sjogren's syndrome and Crohn's disease are known to lead to malignancy. And the relationship goes the other way around too. Immune deficient conditions are known to give rise to malignancies. HIV-related malignancies, celiac, gastric are a few examples. Malignancies are often associated with Hodgkin's, like autoimmunity like Hodgkin's, CLL, and other NHLs. And autoimmune phenomena like SLE and ALPS, etc., again can lead to immune deficiency. So this she called the unholy triacle, and she said whenever you get one, the other two cannot be far behind. But what connects all of them is inflammation and a component of immune dysregulation. How? We'll see in a few moments. So this is the multifaceted role of immunity in cancer. We know that mutagens and cytokines, etc., lead to mutation and genomic instability. Along with environmental exposure, genotoxic damages, etc., it leads to a sequence of inflammation and immunity, which can either give you tissue protective response or immunosurveillance, or a tumor promoting inflammation, again, which can lead to immune surveillance, or and tissue remodeling, tumor promoting inflammation. The sequence of steps along with each one of these is that you get mutations, the tissue repair response, you get more mutations, angiogenesis, invasion, and metastasis. At each stage, there's alteration in the immunity and inflammation involved. Another more stark example is of tumor suppressive immunity and tumor promoting immunity, which go hand in hand. This is the dual role of immunity in cancer treatment. Once you start cancer therapy, the tumor cells break down. It breaks down into necrotic products. These products are recognized by the immune system, which absorbs them, which again release cytokines in response to them, or it activates the T cells. Either of these can have a stimulatory or an inhibitory effect back on the tumor. And chemotherapy and radiation will again enhance this cycle back again. So they're all very interconnected. The damage-associated molecular proteins are the ones which get primed. T cell activation may suppress the tumor, or it may induce tumor-promoting genes to cause chemoresistance. Cancer therapy-mediated immunological conditions which result in fever, therefore, is not just limited to infections. So basically, you can get fever during cancer treatment, either from absence or depletion of the immune system, as in infections, or the systemic inflammatory response syndrome or sepsis. You may also get hyperactivation and dysregulation of the immune system, which classical syndromes are the macrophage activation syndrome and HLH. Or you can get fever when there's repopulation and overstimulation of the immune system. This occurs normally in immune reconstitution syndromes and cytokine storms. So out of these, as you can see, infections is only one part, whereas almost all of the rest are related to inflammation directly or indirectly. So now, when we come back to these three groups, I'll take you through them one by one, out of which only the first one relates to the absence or the depletion of the immune system during cancer chemotherapy. Why is it called febrile neutropenia? This always bugged me. From the time that I first sat with Dr. Zetsi, we used to wonder, why is it just febrile neutropenia? Well, there's a link to it. That was the first thing that was noticed. This is a paper from 1957 by Silver and Beal, which showed that the frequency of bacterial infections was related to the median nature of neutrophil count during periods free of infections. So this is the first time that they were able to show that there was a direct link between neutropenia and infection in patients who were undergoing a treatment for leukemia. But this was not the first paper which showed a link between them. There are earlier papers, this one is a little later, which actually showed this is the first one which showed a direct link between the severity of neutropenia and the increasing risk of infection by Bodhi et al. In 1960. So this leads us to the question that if neutropenia is the only cause for immunosuppression or being immunocompromised, when so many other parts of the immune system are there. So I started looking for definitions of who is considered an immunocompromised host. Surprisingly, we all know instinctively what an immunocompromised host is, but there are no definitions around. The only people who bothered to define it was in the context of vaccination. So when the ACIP committee and the CDC wanted to bring out an advisory on vaccinations in immunocompromised host, that's the first time that they set out defining what an immunocompromised host is. And this is the classification which they came up with. They said A is people who are severely immunocompromised, not as a result of HIV. And then B was, of course, with HIV. And C became all those that cause limited immune deficits. So they are not totally suppressed, but some part of it may be suppressed. And they may require special vaccines or higher doses of vaccines. These included conditions like asplenia, renal failure, etc., which cause specific immune deficits, but not entire across the spectrum ones. So once we get to this definition, obviously what we are going to be dealing with in cancer chemotherapy becomes group A, which is the patients who are severely immunocompromised, but not as a result of HIV. This includes congenital immunodeficiency, leukemia, lymphoma, generalized malignancy, that means a widely metastatic one before it causes immunosuppression, or therapy with all these agents which we commonly use in our practice, and corticosteroids. But corticosteroids, what causes severe immunosuppression? Probably, again, they were the only ones to define it. They used a quantification of more than 2 milligrams per kg or an equivalent dose in adults for more than 14 days. The direct relation between neutrophils and infections was well established more than half a century ago. But it took HIV for us to realize the direct relationship between the lymphocyte counts and infections. So get back to the ZC dictum. When something goes missing, you realize what it's doing. So as the CD4 count drops, all of you might be familiar with it at some time during your MDs, that as it keeps going down, you see a very specific pattern of infections coming up. These infections actually tell you what the CD4 cells are doing. So basically, even a slight decrease in CD4 count results in Mycobacteria TB infections, but it takes a severe drop in CD4 counts to get you atypical mycobacterial infections. Fungal infections can occur pretty early as the CD4 count starts going down. So there's a direct correlation. This is very, very mathematical. The other lessons which we get is from disease, which knock out specific parts of the immune system. So I gave you the lymphocyte example, T lymphocytes. And now this is the phagocyte example. Congenital neutropenias are there, and we know they get gram-negative bacterial infections, Serratia, Nocardia, and Staph. And we have the excellent agammaglobulinemia patients who just can't produce gamma globulin from birth. And we know that these are the infections that they get. So once you get all this, you know that there's a specific pattern which is linking these three arms of the immune system. This is a child with excellent agammaglobulinemia who first came when I was doing my fellowship in Tata Memorial Hospital in the transplant unit. He was referred to as a case of CML. We had worked him up extensively. And then finally he got diagnosed as a case of XLA, and I've treated him for the last 18 years. He's an IIT Madras student now in his third year. But when we were working him up, we just wished that somebody had looked down his throat earlier and would have seen that he had no tonsils at all. For a child who was getting so many infections, there were no tonsils. And this gives us a dead clue that he had X-linked agammaglobulinemia. So just shows you that, history and examination are so important. So once we got all these three arms, we realized that there's a direct link between the immune arms and organisms. And this slide was drawn on a piece of paper like that one, which I showed you earlier by Zinat Karamboy. She said that B cells and complements basically are attacking, your encapsulated organisms like H. influenza, Pneumococcus, Neisseria. Your phagocytes take care of your gram-negative bacteria in Nocardia. Your T cells are attacking your mycobacteria, viruses, and opportunistic infections. But Staphylococci sits between B cells and phagocytes. Also, fungi are actually attacked by both phagocytes and T cells. And Giardia, Echovirus, Mycoplasma, and atypical bacteria are again attacked both by B cells and T cells. This is important. What it tells you is that when one arm of the immune system only is down, you will get only one kind of infection. But if two arms are down, that's, so like let's take for example, the phagocytes are down. If only the phagocytes are down, you will get gram-negative infection. And if only the B cells are down, you will get only encapsulated organism infections. We have seen this. But the moment both are down, you're going to get staph. If only phagocytes are down, you will not get staph. Why? Because the B cells are there to take care of it. Similarly, if only neutropenia is there, you will not get fungal infections because the T cells are there to take care of it. So basically, a fungal infection will come up only due to neutropenia if the neutropenia is profound, severe, and prolonged. Then even if the T cells are intact, you will still get a fungal infection. So this is the beautiful mathematics of how they are all interrelated. So this shows how it's going to go. So let's see what knocks out the phagocytes. Mostly cytotoxic chemotherapy, like these examples over here. What knocks out B cells? Well, steroids, more than 2 milligrams per kg, but you don't need to give it for 2 weeks. Within a few days, it can start knocking out and suppressing the B cells. Rituximab, splenectomy, etc., all affect the B cell and complement system by neutralizing its efficiency. And T cells, you require steroids to be going on for a long time, or you require specific T cell suppressive therapy. So the moment you do this, what you find is that when you give chemotherapy, let's say a case of ALL with induction, you're going to give all these drugs on the right side first. So phagocytes are immediately going to start getting knocked out. All three can get knocked out by steroids, high dose chemotherapy, and radiation. So we'll not go there yet, but we'll just see how they affect initially. So phagocytes are knocked down within 3 to 14 days of starting treatment, within days of starting treatment, and that's why you initially get neutropenia. As you continue down the chemotherapy pipeline, within the second week, by the second week, the B cells also start getting suppressed. So therefore, you start getting infections which are related to both phagocytes and T cells. But it takes 2 to 4 weeks to knock out the T cells. And that is when the opportunistic infections start coming. So initially, when you start chemotherapy, you get only neutropenia. So you get gram-negative infections. Then as the B cells start getting suppressed, you start getting staphylococcal. But if you suppress the B cells much more, then you can get encapsulated organisms. But as you suppress the immune system more and more, like classically your ALL reaching the 3rd and 4th week of induction, that's when you start getting mycobacteria, opportunistic infections, etc. And by this time, since both are down, fungal infections come up, and viral infections, opportunistic infections come really if you continue this still very long. So therefore, what we do for the empirical treatment of febrile neutropenia, almost any protocol that you see is going to initially begin with broad spectrum antibiotics, which attack gram-negative bacteria. And if you don't get a response in 2 to 3 days, you add a gram-positive cover. And if you don't get another response in another few more days, you add antifungus and consider antivirals. Now, this strategy was reviewed by PISO, which I've not shown in my slides over here. And it showed that from the last 50 years, the basic components of this strategy in the management of febrile neutropenia, as it is called, has not changed at all. But as you can see, that this policy is not detected by neutropenia alone. So therefore, it's not so empirical at all. It follows the logic of the immune system, which is there from thousands and million years of evolution and cannot be changed. So this is the algorithm for approaching febrile immunosuppressia infections. You can be using either cytotoxic therapy or lymphodepletion therapy primarily. Most of your cytotoxic therapy will be myelosuppressive, and they'll end up with gram-negative antibiotics. But as you get more cytotoxic, you might end up suppressing the B cells also. Then you need to cover for staph. And if it is also gets very severe, that's when your antifungals get added. But if you're using only lymphodepletion therapy, like we do a lot now, we use only lymphocyte targeted agents, you may be suppressing the B cells, T cells, or both. Accordingly, you will be having to use, according to the charts which I shown, either gram-positive antibiotics, or you would have to start covering for opportunistic infections and tuberculosis, or you will have to start thinking of atypical bacteria and viral infections. So coming back to the chart that we saw, we have covered not just febrile neutropenia, we have covered the entire absence or depletion of the immune system and infections that go with it. So let's take the next one, which is hyperactivation and dysregulation of the immune system. This is all now what we are talking about are inflammatory syndromes. Now, inflammation is an inevitable part of infection. And from this, you can see that when any inflammation, systemic inflammatory response, it is called the systemic inflammatory response syndrome for that reason. There's a secretion of cytokines along with infection. TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-10, and IFN gamma are all secreted. And this graph from Risch et al. Shows you how the difference between those who had septic shock and who had no septic shock, the stark difference in the secretion of cytokines. Now, this is normal response. We're not yet talking about a dysregulated response. This also had an impact on survival. As you can see, that higher secretion of cytokine levels was associated with poor survival. So infection alone is not the component of fever alone. It is also inflammation. All these cytokines cause fever, and they are directly related to morbidity and mortality. So when we are treating fever in immunocompromised patients, we are not just treating with antimicrobials, we also have to take care of the inflammatory response. So this results in, now this was normal inflammatory response, which itself can be fatal. Now think about when the inflammatory response gets dysregulated. So this is what results in the macrophage activation syndrome, or HLH, or cytokine storm, or immune deconstitution syndromes, or autoimmune phenomena. So dysregulation results in these. So this classical example is HLH, which we often overlook. we don't look for it. So you have to learn to look for it. It's a very eerie and fascinating disease in which cells of your own body start turning on your own cells and start eating them up. This is in short how HLH can arise. Basically, an effector T cell attacks its target cell by entering it through perforin and releasing granzymes. And this has got several proteins and enzymes which control this pathway. Each one of them could be deficient, resulting in a primary immune deficiency syndrome, which results in familial HLH, which normally presents below 4 years of age, but and is almost always fatal. So why is it relevant to us? It's relevant to us because each one of these proteins can also be suppressed by some part of our cancer chemotherapy. So what happens in normal pathogenesis, normal immune response, is that trigger and activation results in a cytotoxic T cell maturing, polarizing, docking, priming, fusing, degranulating, and killing the cell. But when it becomes uncontrolled and ineffective, then the trigger activation, there's a failure to kill the target cells, failure to contract the immune response. Therefore, this results in a continuous stimulation of the immune response, which results in uncontrolled expansion of cytotoxic T cells and an uncontrolled activation of macrophages, which results in the clinical picture of HLH. So HLH is not rare. In a period of 3 to 4 years from the time I joined, when we started looking at it in Tata Memorial Hospital in our patients in pediatrics, we quickly totaled about 50 patients who had developed it. And this is a breakup of the kind of patients which were there, with the mean ferritin levels ranging to several 40 to 50,000 to even lakhs. There is no strong correlation between very high hyperferritinemia in adults, but in children it correlates much better. The same patients, the trigger was often bacterial sepsis, but that was only a handful. Almost you can see the majority of the causes were non-bacterial. And out of them, only 2 had a recognized perforin deficiency. We have continued to add up these patients, and this is the next set of 41 patients in the next era. But over time, we have so probably close to 9,100 patients now. And this is an analysis of the next 40 patients, which shows pretty much the same findings and the same distribution of causes. So it is consistent over time, the kind of cases of secondary HLH that we've been seeing in our malignancy patients. They were treated mostly with DEXA alone, and very few required the full HLH protocol. And in the second era, we were better off. We managed to save 65% of our patients. In the earlier era, we were able to save only about 50%. So this correlates HLH for you with the kind of why you should be looking at it in both pediatric and adult oncology. When you in this large study in which they try to see the kind of mutations which patients had of confirmed HLH from a registry of nearly 500 patients, they found that from no mutations, as you move towards biallelic both nonsense mutations, the trigger required for getting the HLH started becoming less and less. So basically, you required a trigger from leishmania and all, if that's the only kind known when no mutations are found. But arthritis or driven inflammation can result in HLH even in a monoallelic patient who's got a monoallelic mutation. But as you come down, the genetic propensity keeps increasing, and even a commonly encountered viral pathogen can trigger a fatal infection. So the genetic ones to the right end of your screen are the ones which we see in pediatrics, mostly because they will not survive to adulthood. But as you keep coming to the left, you can find even in adults HLH being triggered out, because many people, even in the normal population, carry a monoallelic or a biallelic missense mutation. And they don't get HLH just like that, but when they have a malignancy and they undergo cancer chemotherapy and some part of the immune system gets suppressed, then it triggers off a fatal or very severe HLH response. So what do you do? Well, don't panic. Coming back to where we were, coming to the last part of this, you can also get immune dysregulation from repopulation and overstimulation of the immune system, which we normally call the immune reconstitution syndrome and cytokine storms. This is IRIS, as it is known, was first described in the context of HIV. What you see in the panel above is the sort of normal response. You have a CD4 cell and a resting macrophage, and suppose you get a tubercular infection, then the CD4 T cells get fully activated, They activate the infected macrophages, which has ingested the mycobacteria, and that leads to bacterial containment with limited immunopathology. But when the CD4 cells have been missing, then these prime macrophages are not able to control and recruit more and more macrophages to contain the infection. But once the CD4 cells get reintroduced back into the body, either because it is recovering due to antiretroviral therapy in the case of HIV over here, then that's when there's a lot of accumulation of prime macrophages and there's a excessive inflammatory response resulting in tissue destruction. So this was originally described for HIV, but as you can see, the same concept applies in cancer immunotherapy and cancer chemotherapy also. So you will see this in our setting in post-transplant, in post-solid organ transplant, post-intensive chemotherapy. Remember, the intensive chemotherapy also knocks off the lymphocyte system. And many of our malignancies, they require one intensive chemotherapy cycle after the other. So it can remain suppressed for a long time. And when it is repopulating, ideally one or two, when the intensive chemotherapy cycles are over, or you're just at the end of an intensive chemotherapy cycle, when the lymphocyte counts are coming up, you can get a iris kind of response. And more recently, you can see it in the context of CAR T cell therapy, where you have the patient's own cells have been knocked out, or either because of chemotherapy and conditioning regimen. And then when the CAR T cells are repopulating inside the body, they can cause a severe cytokine storm. So therefore, coming back to my case, febrile immunosuppressia is not just infections, and definitely not due to the absence of neutrophils. The spectrum of fever with an immunosuppressed individual covers infections, inflammations, normal inflammatory responses, dysregulated inflammatory responses, dysregulated immune responses, and which consist of autoimmunity, MAS, HLH, and immune reconstitution. This slide towards the end of my presentation sort of sums it up, what they are and how to manage them. As you look from the right to the left of your screen, you will find that environmental factors dominate, and then towards the left, the host factors dominate. When the host may not be that susceptible, but just because of the introduction of microbiome, or if he's immunosuppressed because of, let's say, cancer chemotherapy, they can get bacterial infections which require antimicrobials, and I showed you the way they would require that. As they get more immunodeficient, then you may require immune supplementation. So these are the patients where you need to consider growth factors like GCSF, GMCSF, IVIG, maybe granulocyte transfusion, or you may require these patients to be supplemented by other means. We can talk about that later. Then as you come down the line, they can get dysregulated syndromes. That's the macrophage activation syndrome, which can be treated with corticosteroids. But as the cytokine storm gets more and more severe, you need to bring in your cytokine inhibitors. And once it goes into a full-fledged HLH syndrome, so remember, these are hyperactivated T cells. Then these T cells are going to require killing. That's when you use cytotoxic agents like etoposide, etc. And if it is really, the environmental factors might be very minor. It may be that the host is susceptible because he's got a biallelic nonsense mutation, which means that even the slightest infection or any trigger could trigger off a very severe syndrome. And these are the ones who require bone marrow transplant only to survive. So this sort of covers the whole system conceptually and connects them all through the dots for you. So I rest my case by telling you that the whole term of febrile neutropenia is outdated, and it really needs to be replaced by febrile immunosuppressia, because this opens up your thinking. When you think of febrile neutropenia, I get resident after resident who only sees the neutrophil count and says, sir, the neutrophil count is okay, so that's why I'm giving an outpatient drug and sending him home. That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. You must go through the entire spectrum. You must see which stage his treatment he is in. The neutrophil counts may have recovered, but the lymphocyte counts may not have, or the lymphocyte counts may have recovered, and that might be the bad thing because there's a reconstitution occurring now. So you have to look at it holistically, and you have to recognize that it is not just microbes which are causing the problem, but also the inflammatory response and also the dysregulation of the inflammatory and immune response. So my case is that we should call it immunosuppressia. And I hope that to some extent I might have been able to make you think about these problems in this way. I thank you for your attention. This was a special friend, the first girl whom I treated with ALL while I was in the Navy after leaving Tata Memorial Hospital when I'd gone back, who came to say bye to me when I was leaving there. So with that, I will leave you now, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you very much, Gaurav, for a very nice talk, which explained the basics of immunosuppressive fevers and their management. We have few questions already. Usually, almost all the talks, the audience is muted. So the questions are there in the chat. You may be able to have a look at the chat yourself and read the question, and then you can go and answer it. Or I can read it for you.
Sure. I've just got out of the screen sharing board, and now I'm looking at all the questions. So,
the
I
first
think the
is
initial ones.
in secondary HLH, infection related. What is the trigger to start IVIG or full HLH protocol? This is a question from Virat.
Right. So Virat says in secondary HLH, what is the trigger to start IVIG full protocol? So I sort of rushed through those slides where I showed you how we had managed them. But what I did try to emphasize over there is that most of them required DEXA alone. So what you need to remember is that people contest the HLH protocol, which you refer to both 94 and 2004. They were trial protocols, and both of them had malignancy as an exclusion criteria. So basically, those protocols, what it means that they are not validated in malignant patients and patients with malignancies. So to use the full HLH protocol in a patient with malignancy is actually incorrect because it was never devised for them. Having said that, patients do require treatment, and they develop a spectrum of disorders. So where it merges from macrophage activation syndrome and where it merges into HLH is a very difficult thing to make out in patients who are already getting cancer chemotherapy and maybe having cytopenias because they've received chemotherapy. So it was difficult. What you need to do is you have to be alert on your feet. You have to understand what might be going on. That's why I gave you this talk today, to help you understand what is going on inside the patient. And this, in a given clinical situation, it's really your judgment when he has moved into a full-blown syndrome that you would require cytotoxic chemotherapy. So from the chart which I showed you, the 90-100 patients that we have managed, the majority of them were managed with DEXA alone, and we did not have to go for the full-blown protocol. So when I feel that the B cell suppressive is more in that particular patient, I use IVIG, but we don't use it all the time. So that's how we decide. We decide which one is suppressed, which one is likely, which arm is likely to have gone in that patient, and we attack accordingly. Yes, so that your next question. Since it is dysregulated in response, mere control of the infection may not be sufficient. This is exactly the point I was trying to make. And if everybody has understood that, then I think it's been worth it. So that's exactly the whole point. Do we have any criteria when should we initiate full HLH? Because it is very subjective. It is subjective because the HLH protocol, like I said, was described only for patients who didn't have malignancies. It was never tested or tried as a protocol in patients who had malignancies. So as oncologists, we have to be very, very careful in how we adapt the protocol to what looks like MAS or HLH in our patients. Dose of DEXA for HLH. So we start around 10 milligrams per meter square dose in pediatrics. I suggest you use the same dose in adults, but stick to the ceiling doses. Don't exceed that. Generally that's enough. 2 to 3 days we normally see with DEXA. And if the fevers are not coming down, normally if the response is there, it will be dramatic. But if it is not there, then that's when we start thinking of adding etoposide to it. Multiple lines of chemotherapy is a risk factor for immune dysregulation. Oh, yes, it is. It is. So, like I showed you, each protein, each aspect, each gene, each protein controlling each step of the cytotoxicity, the actions of a cytotoxic T cell upon the target cell can be suppressed by a different agent. So you can have steroids suppressing the CD40 ligand, for example. So the translation does not occur onto the T cell. So at each step, they can be individually suppressed. And when you're given multiple rounds of chemotherapy of different kinds, including myeloablative regimes like conditioning for stem cell transplant, it's almost everything is gone. So therefore, you can get a cytokine storm through the left side or from the right side. You often do not know which one might be acting. In patients who don't have chemotherapy, when they develop it, it's much easier to guess that. Okay, there's a question from
Here's a
Logan
question on Leoflox prophylaxis, just above the question you answered. Leoflox prophylaxis in pediatric cases for febrile neutropenia.
So we don't use levoflox prophylaxis for febrile neutropenia because, but there has been some, efforts to study it. I know somebody's trying to start a trial in that. One of our group, Dr. Nirmal Malik, was thinking about it, but we haven't found the evidence to be that great. What we do is that we screen all our patients for colonization with MDR before when they come into us. The day they present, we take a rectal swab and we screen for MDR. And if these patients who are colonized with MDR, when they get FN, we begin with a carbapenem combination along with colistin upfront. It's a de-escalation strategy of antibiotic usage, which we have published, which is recommended also by the IDSA, where gram-negative, where MDR incidence of MDR infection is very high. So we come into that. I think more than 30 to 40% of the patients who come to us are already colonized with MDR at the day of presentation, and we used to have a lot of deaths due to MDR sepsis. So we have been following a de-escalation policy for treatment, but we are not using prophylaxis.
Right.
A patient of AML having HLH, how to manage? So the principles are the same. So normally, surprisingly, you don't get that much HLH in AML. It's more in ALL, and the reason is simple. To get HLH, you require more lymphosuppressive therapy because really that's where the problem lies. It's an over-regulated lymphocyte response when one part of it is suppressed. So AML patients don't get that much HLH. We have also not seen that much. In the data also, which I showed you, AML patients were few. But if you get it, you have to manage it pretty much the same way. We would start DEXA first and then take it from there. Is it mostly clinical if patient is not responding to antibacterial and antifungal and antivirals? We plan to do a bone marrow, so HLH or just ferritin. So the criteria for HLH, which you quote, are from the HLH trial protocol. The HLH trial protocol, like I have already explained, for trial protocols and exclusion criteria was malignancy. So those protocols are not validated by cancer patients. Neither are those criteria validated in cancer patients. So in fact, we have no term for this situation. If you go by the literature, you just call it malignancy associated IAH, HLH. That's it. But it's not really, many people contest that it exists as an entity at all. So, the literature is all out there. I recently met an expert on HLH who says that there is no such thing as secondary HLH. So he contests that it doesn't exist. So, but we do see these patients who have got evidence of dysregulated immune response. So their ferritins are high, their cholesterols are out of the way, they got a coagulopathy, they're showing the full spectrum, and you're not getting anything on the cultures. Cytokine levels, if you do them, they are high. So these are the patients which qualify for these diagnoses, and you just have to treat them that way. How do you follow response to steroid in secondary HLH? Do you follow it clinically? When HLH is there, the response to steroids is dramatic. Your fever generally responds within 24 to 36 hours, if not faster. So then you're on the right track. The problem comes when it does not respond. Then you don't know whether to go more aggressive or whether to get less aggressive. So there is no literature to guide you. there is very little literature out there on secondary HLH and cancer patients, because not too many have seen that many patients. We hope that when we publish our 100 odd cases, that it will form a guideline for most people. How frequent HLH in solid organ malignancies? Less common. So again, because of the same reason as for AML, cytotoxic chemotherapy does not cause that much HLH. Lymphosuppressive therapy causes more. Excuse me, my throat was going a little dry. How do you differentiate MAS and HLH clinically? You don't. They are a spectrum. That's why I showed you the continuity. And as far as malignancies are concerned, it doesn't even matter, because, like we showed you, the HLH criteria and the HLH trials excluded malignancy. So you are never going to get a classical definition of HLH in a malignant patient. So it doesn't matter. But once you are convinced that the lab parameters and the clinical parameters are showing to you that this is inflammation, and it is dysregulated inflammation because of the reasons which I explained, then that's moving up the spectrum from a normal SIRS response to MAS and HLH. It's moving to the left of that scale, which I showed you in the last slide. As it is moving to the left of the scale, your antibacterials, antivirals, or antimicrobials are no longer going to help. You have to step up and address the inflammation. Soluble IL-6, we have asked for it. So hopefully, we asked for it with respect to our CAR T cell trial, which is coming up. The whole panel of cytokines. So we'll be doing it in-house very soon. Would you consider adding etoposide to another agent if no response to steroids? Yes, yes, Satyajit, definitely. We would like to have, we do end up adding etoposide about maybe 1/3 of the times, approximately, in severe HLH. We do end up adding etoposide. What distinguishes ferritin level as an acute inflammatory reactant versus HLH? No one test can tell you the difference between the two. So you have to look at the whole spectrum. You have to look at the clinical spectrum. You have to look at your lab reports, and you have to see what you've been giving the patient so far and how they've been responding, and then you have to decide.
I think that pretty much gets us to the end of the topic. Yeah, do you want to add anything in the finishing touch?
No, I think I've spoken a lot. My main aim is to make people think. I want to shake you out of your comfort zone and looking for set answers, and understand what's going on and think. There is no clear answers. Yeah, that's
actually,
what I would like to say.
Actually, that's what I need to tell, because essentially the talk you given is thought-provoking. I keep on telling all my students, as well as whomsoever I meet, try to ask questions why. Why this is happening. People tend to just mug things up, which may work in the undergraduate level, but now at this level, mugging is not possible. So why the mechanism, how things happen? I think that's what you probably made them think about, and thank you for that.
Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for joining in. See you next week. Goodbye, good night.
Thank you, good night.